Well, we had two American economists win the Nobel Prize for Economics, I think it was yesterday. Nordhaus, Professor Nordhaus, and Professor Roma. Roma and Nordhaus both won the Nobel Prize. They'll each get, I think, $1 million from the Swedish Nobel Committee. And everybody's been praising them to the hilt. And I particularly found this one article in the Wall Street Journal by David Henderson. Now, I don't know if you know who David Henderson is, but David Henderson is a well-known free market economist who teaches at the Graduate Naval Academy in Monterey. I know David, and David is a bit of an Ayn Rand fan, and he is a decent, good economist, right? But he always writes the commentary for the Wall Street Journal about the Nobel Prize winners, and he always tries to bring out the positive and not criticize them at all because they won the Nobel Prize. So they're there to, to bring out the positives. So what's this got to do with the carbon tax? Well, the carbon tax is a proposal that has been, I don't think he initiated this, but he has been a huge proponent of William Nordhaus, the now Nobel Prize winner in economics for this year. He won the prize for his economics of climate change. Basically what he's done is built these massive economic models that predict the impact of climate change. Let's say temperatures go up by X. And let's say there's a cost associated with the temperatures going up because you have to invest, because now the climate's doing all kinds of things. You have to invest all kinds of money to not flood Florida, the climate is causing all kinds of damage and all kinds of wacky things. So you have to make investments, right? So there's a cost to climate change. So you model that. What's the cost going to be over the next 100 years of climate change? And then he asked the question, if we had a carbon tax and we modeled the impacts of a carbon tax on the economy, how would that impact the economy long term? And he's built these very sophisticated economic models that try to make these kind of predictions. And he has become a huge advocate for the carbon tax as a consequence. Now, we'll get to that in a second, because if you actually follow the models, you wouldn't be, but anyway, we'll get to that. What's interesting is that, one of my critiques of the climate change models, and I'm not an expert on this, so I don't have a strong position about whether climate change is happening or not, caused by CO2 or not. I'm not going to get into that debate. But one of my critiques, and one of the critiques that is offered out there all the time, is of the models. The models are not very good. The models don't predict. The models have been wrong so many times. The models are trying to take a very, very complex environment and try to build it into a mathematical equation. And it's very, very, very hard. We don't know enough to actually predict the future climate, to predict changes in the climate, and therefore the models are bad because of all that. Now, if that is true about the climate, and it is, I think, true about the climate, we do not understand climate science enough yet to truly model these things out and make accurate predictions about the future. Hell, we don't even know what the weather is going to be like next year, but somehow we can model this out over 100 years and tell exactly what the temperature rise will be in the future. Yeah, Jonathan Honey points out that the models in the 70s predicted an ice age in the 90s. That didn't turn out right. Those were headlines, by the way, in the New York Times in the 1970s. The ice age is coming. If you think that's hard in terms of climate, and it is really hard, even the climate change people will admit that it's really, really hard. It is like 1,000 times harder when it comes to economics. It is really, really, really hard in economics. Because in economics, you have factors that you can't take into account. For example, the discovery of new technologies, the innovation of the human mind, the role of reason, the fact that if you tax something, what happens not only to the consumption of that thing, but how does that filter through the entire economy, and how does that affect innovation? And what about new discoveries? What about discoveries of technology to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere or whatever? You can't model that. What about human choices? I mean, economics is the science of human choices, or one of the things it does is studies human choices in the marketplace. The choices of producers, the choices of consumers, the choices of who to trade, under what price, under what conditions. Choices. How do you model choices mathematically? How do you put an equation together and therefore model what's going to happen with any kind of accuracy? Well, you can't. I mean, models are fine. They give us an approximation of stuff. They tell us kind of things that are interesting. I don't know if I told you this story in my first macroeconomic class that I took. The only economics class I ever took in an economics department. I got a PhD in finance. And I had to take 2 economics classes, a macro and a micro. And I think it was the macro class. And I walked into the first class in macro, and the professor put a differential equation on the board. Probably a differential equation created by one of these Nobel Prize winners. And he said, the entire course, we're going to derive stuff from this equation. Really? And that's going to explain the economy? Or maybe it was microeconomics and it was a production function. But either way, it was stupid. And the rest of the class, all we did was differential equation, derision from one differential equation. And it was dumb, and it was not economics. And I went to my advisor and I said, I'm never taking another economics class in my life. You find a way to get me a PhD in finance without taking economic classes from these idiots, from these losers, because I'm not learning anything there. It's a complete waste of time. We did an independent study instead. Anyway, these are the kind of models that now Nordhaus and Roma devised. Now, what is interesting? Let's see. Nordhaus did a few interesting things. This is where in the Wall Street Journal, my friend David Henderson is trying to bring out some positives. So one interesting thing, and this is truly interesting, and this is fascinating actually. So listen to this. Pay attention to the numbers. The numbers are important here. The price of light. The price of light. So Nordhaus calculated how much the price of lighting, to read, to light your house, has dropped over the last 200 years. And he has shown that the price of light in 1992, adjusted for inflation, so taking out inflation, was less than 0.1% of the price of light in 1800. So notice that even when you adjust for inflation, the price of light in 1992 is 0.1% of what it was in 1800. So if the price of light, let's say, was $1 in 1800, then the price of light in 1992 would be 10 cents. Now, you can't capture that in inflation numbers. You can't capture that in aggregate numbers that the government produces. That addition to the quality of life, that addition to the standard of living cannot be captured numerically. And as a consequence, all our inflation numbers are exaggerated. All our inflation numbers are exaggerated because they can't take into account the fact that while a computer today costs the same as a computer did 20 years ago, so inflation in the basket is zero for that good, the computer today is so much better. Like 1,000 times better, 1,000,000 times better. How do you capture that? We don't. And therefore, when people say standard of living in the United States have not increased in the last 30 years, 40 years, which is a favorite line of the left these days, and of Trump supporters. I mean, I shouldn't have to say that, right? Trump supporters are on the left. I mean, the real supporters, not the people who voted for him. That's just not true. We didn't have an iPhone 30 years ago. And everybody has an iPhone. Everybody can afford an iPhone, the equivalent of an iPhone, a smartphone. How do you measure that? How do you measure that in standard of living and economic growth? It doesn't get captured. And that's why aggregate economic numbers are often meaningless in terms of really giving us a picture of the quality of life, of the true increase in the standard of living. And certainly that is true if you compare 1800 to today. Now, economists might say we're 500 times wealthier. But that's not true. We're like 1,000,000 times wealthier. It might be in things we can measure only 500 times wealthier. But in real quality of life, in real improvement, in quality of life, it's 1,000,000 times. It's 1,000,000 times. All right, so that was an interesting thing that Nordhaus observed and really valuable. The other thing is this whole CO2 thing, and he built this whole model about CO2, and he came up with this number that the optimal tax is $30 for each ton of carbon dioxide. And politicians have grabbed onto that, and activists have grabbed onto that, and they run with it. And a carbon tax like that would increase the price of gasoline by about 27 cents a gallon, right? Now, when you actually look at the model, and Nordhaus himself has actually looked at the model, he said, look, I don't know, $30 for each ton of carbon dioxide, that seems a little high. It's hard to tell. It might be too low. It might be too high. We actually don't know. He said the actual optimal tax should be somewhere between $6 a ton and $93 a ton. $6 a ton and $93 a ton, 15 times bigger. Which means your economics sucks, Nordhaus. You might have got a Nobel Prize for economics, but this sucks. You can't predict anything. You give me that kind of variation between 6 to 93, it's meaningless. But that's, of course, what has to happen. The fundamental premise here is that a central planner can somehow define exactly what the tax should be. They can't. It's impossible. Central planning is a losing strategy, and that's true of climate change and carbon taxes and every other form of central planning. Now, another economist, a free market economist by the name of Robert Murphy, has calculated the present value of damages caused by carbon dioxide, assuming Nordhaus's assumptions about damage, and abatement costs at $22.6 trillion. Right? That's the present value today. Mr. Nordhaus' optimal carbon tax would have reduced damages but increased abatement costs, decreasing the impact of emissions to a total of $19.5 trillion. So in other words, this carbon tax would actually have very little impact on actual long-term economic growth, if you will. Meanwhile, right, the Nordhaus model shows that the cost of a policy to limit the temperature increase to only 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit would have been $37.03 trillion. That's a lot of money. That's in present value terms. 16.4 trillion more than the cost of doing nothing. So actually putting a policy in place that decreases carbon emissions so that the temperatures only rise by 2.7 instead of the 4 point something that they're predicting, 4.1 degrees that they're predicting, would actually cost the economy more than not doing anything. Not doing anything. So even if you accept the numbers of these stupid models, which I don't, they advise, from a purely economic perspective, to do nothing. No carbon tax. Let the world heat up. It's cheaper to deal with the consequences of the world heating up than to fight carbon emissions. This is your lesson of today. It's cheaper one day in the future, when we're richer, more prosperous, have better technology, to deal with the consequences of a warming climate, if indeed it's warming, much cheaper than it is to put in place today the laws and regulations, the costs, in other words, that would keep temperatures rising only 2.7 degrees instead of 4.1. So the whole thing is nuts. Free markets work, By the time climate change becomes a problem, we'll be so rich, we'll deal with it. We'll have the technology to deal with it.